Fukushima Daiichi, the earthquake felt around the world. Fukushima was the world's worst nuclear accident since Chernobyl. Both nuclear accidents were level 7 on the radiological event scale, but Fukushima released only 10% of the amount of radiation released at Chernobyl. In Chernobyl, the reactor accident was caused from the reactor exploding due to a runaway power surge followed by a steam and hydrogen explosion and a sustained fire in the reactor. The explosion and fire that lasted for several days at Chernobyl, and the fact there is no containment structure, propelled radioactive material from the reactor core high into the atmosphere and across Eastern and Western Europe for at least 10 days. The explosion at Fukushima was due to hydrogen buildup in the reactor building and not the reactor itself like Chernobyl. After Chernobyl, the Soviet government evacuated all inhabitants in the area and left the surrounding area as a dead zone. Japan's government does not have that option. Land is already scarce, and long-term evacuation of the area is not an option for the Japanese. Japan plans to make Fukushima habitable once again after decontamination levels are reduced and radiation levels are sustained for habitation. Engineers are decontaminating 1,000 square kilometers of land. To decontaminate this area, workers are power spraying buildings to remove contamination. Soil is being removed from fields, and workers are also removing fallen leaves and undergrowth from the woods surrounding the houses of Fukushima. To decontaminate the area, the Japanese Ministry of Environment estimates Fukushima will have to remove as much as 31 million cubic meters of contaminated soil and debris at a cost of more than 1 trillion yen. Areas contaminated to dose levels with a dose of 20 millisieverts per year, or roughly 2 rem per year, above background should be cleaned up to reduce levels by 50% for adults and by 60% for children within 2 years, and to bring them to a long-term level of 0.1 rem per year above background radiation levels. This dose level is approximately the same amount of radiation exposure a patient would receive from a full-body CAT scan. Since Fukushima is not a long-term evacuation, many government and for-hire companies are experimenting with decontamination efforts. The Japanese government has recommended removing leaf litter from woods within 65 feet of homes and deeply plowing or turning over fields to dilute contamination. Farmers are also power washing their orchards or shaving the bark off trees. The Fukushima Department of Agriculture has also recommended that farmers add potassium fertilizer if their fields are contaminated, as the potassium will help minimize the cesium uptake by the crops. The removed contaminated soil will be stored in temporary storage sites or be kept safely on the spot. Measures will be taken to prevent the discharge and/or drainage of radioactive material. The one downside of decontamination efforts is the environmental effect. Taking away the soil, leaves, and undergrowth from the environment destroys the ecosystem. The radioactive particles tend to mix with the soil, making decontamination efforts impossible without removing large quantities of soil, leaves, and existing growth. Before the Fukushima accident, Japan produced roughly 30% of the country's energy demand from nuclear power. Japan has 54 nuclear reactors throughout the country. In Japan, the local government's approval is required for every reactor startup. In May 2012, Japan's last critical nuclear reactor shut down for maintenance, and this was the first time since 1966 that Japan was without nuclear-produced electrical power. Although in July 2013, 2 nuclear reactors were started at the Oi nuclear power plant to manage electrical demands during peak summer hours. Of the existing plants that are currently shut down, many may never be restarted and come back online due to safety concerns or public opposition. Japan's public supports a nuclear power phase-out by 2040. Japan's powerful nuclear village and the current government are strongly opposed to a phase-out. Japan's nuclear energy role in the future is still to be determined. China currently has 16 operational nuclear reactors with 26 reactors under construction and 51 reactors planned for future construction. After March 11th, China suspended the approval of further nuclear power projects until new safety plans were in effect. Beijing has moved closer to ending its suspension after unveiling a plan to upgrade security standards at nuclear facilities by 2015. China is still on pace of pursuing a 400% increase in nuclear capability by 2015. India's nuclear power program consists of 20 nuclear reactors at 6 nuclear power plants. A week after the Fukushima accident, the Indian government responded stating its nuclear program had been reviewed and that the program was safe. In 2010, 28% of Germany's energy was produced by nuclear power from 17 reactors. 7 of Germany's oldest plants shut down permanently in response to the Fukushima accident, and an 8th reactor never to be started up again. Germany's environment minister stated that Germany would shut down all of its nuclear reactors by 2022. Before Fukushima, Italy had not had a nuclear power program. In June 2011, a referendum imposed a permanent ban on the introduction of a nuclear power program. Switzerland also voted that it will shut down all of its nuclear power plants by 2034. After Fukushima, the U.S. nuclear energy industry inspected all nuclear power plants to ensure they would withstand similar extreme natural events. The United States also adopted a strategy to ensure lessons learned are applied quickly and effectively. Since Fukushima, the NRC now requires plant operators to install or improve venting systems to limit core damage in a serious accident. Plants also have to set up sophisticated equipment to monitor water levels in pools of spent nuclear fuel. The NRC also requires nuclear power plants to improve protection of safety equipment installed after the September 11, 2001 terror attacks, and all nuclear power plants must be able to handle damage to multiple reactors at the same time. These new rules have an implementation deadline of 2016. After the Fukushima accident, many nuclear reactor designs were in consideration. Westinghouse developed the AP1000 pressurized water reactor. In the event of a design basis accident, such as a coolant pipe break, the plant is designed to achieve and maintain safe shutdown condition without any operator action and without the need for AC power or pumps. Instead of relying on the components such as diesel generators and pumps, the AP1000 relies on the natural force of gravity, natural circulation, and compressed gas to keep the core and containment from overheating. In the event of a severe accident, the operator can flood reactor cavity space immediately surrounding the reactor vessel with coolant and submerging the reactor vessel. The coolant is sufficient to prevent molten core debris in the lower head from melting the steel vessel wall and spilling into the containment. The major safety advantage of the AP1000 is long-term accident mitigation is maintained without operator action or the reliance on off-site or on-site AC power. Thorium-based reactors are under design consideration. Natural thorium, which is cheap and abundant, doesn't contain enough fissile material to sustain a nuclear chain reaction. But by mixing thorium oxide with 10% plutonium oxide, criticality can be achieved. This fuel can be formed into rods and used in a conventional nuclear reactor. Not only does this mean that we can do away with uranium, which is expensive to enrich, dangerous, and leads to nuclear proliferation, but it also means that we can finally have an easy way of recycling plutonium. Furthermore, the fuel cycle produces no new plutonium. It actually reduces the world's stock of plutonium. And these make for much safer nuclear reactors too, due to a higher melting point and thermal conductivity. Molten salt reactors are a safer alternative than using water as a coolant. The core of a fuel pellet is roughly 2,000 degrees Celsius, far greater than the boiling point of water. When the reactor is shut down, water is still needed to be pumped throughout the reactor to provide continuous cooling. Losing the ability to pump water causes the problem seen at Fukushima. Molten salt has a boiling point temperature much higher than the boiling point temperature of the fuel. The molten salt is mixed with the fuel. If the reactor starts to heat up, the salt will expand spreading out the fuel and slowing reactions and allowing the reactor to cool down. In the event of a power outage, a stopper at the bottom of the reactor melts and the fuel and salt flow into a holding tank, where the fuel spreads out enough where the reactions will stop. The salt then cools and solidifies, encapsulating the radioactive material. A molten salt reactor will produce 4 kilograms of radioactive waste a year, compared to 20 metric tons produced by a conventional reactor. Since Fukushima, there is still no worldwide plan to assist a country that has a nuclear accident. Director General Yukiya Amano stated to the UN that putting international nuclear experts in touch with each other quickly during a crisis needs improvement. In the United States, the emergency planning responsibilities for nuclear power plants fall into 2 categories: on-site, which deals with responding to the accident within the nuclear facility, and off-site, which deals with the consequences to the surrounding area and population. Power plant owners are responsible for on-site emergency planning. State and local governments are responsible for off-site emergency planning. Power plants must immediately notify state and local authorities and the NRC. Federal emergency planning criteria specifies 2 types of emergency planning zones: the 10-mile emergency planning zone, where people could be harmed by direct radiation exposure and requires protective measures such as evacuation or sheltering, and the 50-mile emergency planning zone, where the primary concern is contamination of water and food supplies, and evacuation is at the discretion of local authorities. Currently at Fukushima, the exposure to radiation outside the 20-kilometer zone is still 30 millisieverts and as high as 50 millisieverts at some points. 50 millisieverts is equal to 5 rem, which was the equivalent of the yearly occupational exposure limit for nuclear workers. Iodine 131 has a relatively low half-life and is still not of any concern, but cesium 137 has a half-life of 30 years and is still in the environment. Currently, at one of the radioactive liquid holding tanks, there was a radiation spike of 22,000 millisieverts near the water holding tanks. This was a jump from 1,800 millisieverts from 4 days earlier. These levels are strong to kill an unprotected worker within hours of being exposed to this constant level. TEPCO has stated that the tank does not have any leaks, but in the previous month, they have admitted to having one of their tanks leak 300 tons of contaminated water. In July of 2012, a Japanese legislative inquiry concluded that the disaster at Fukushima nuclear power plant could have been prevented and was considered man-made. The report concluded that steps could have been taken to anticipate the effects of an earthquake and tsunami, but there was multiple errors and negligence that left the site unprepared. If TEPCO had their diesel generators and fuel tanks placed on higher ground, protected from flooding, and means of pumping water into the reactor in the event of a loss of water cooling, and if they had a better emergency plan, then they might not have lost the nuclear reactor. Prior to the 2011 crisis, regulators had avoided instituting or enforcing rules that might have cost TEPCO additional investment but would have also protected the public more effectively. These public and private institutions all failed to correctly develop the most basic safety requirements, such as assessing the probability of damage, preparing for containing collateral damage from such a disaster, and developing evacuation plans for the public in the case of a serious radiation release. The report states that NISA and the operators were aware of the risk of core damage from the tsunami. No regulations were created, nor did TEPCO take any protective steps against the tsunami. The report also states that the emergency plans were not thought out, nor were they implemented in a timely manner.